Hello, everyone. This is Sait Akşit, the Director of the Strategy and Energy Policies Research Center. I have the pleasure to host actually Associate Professor Dr. Derya Göçer from Middle East Technical University today on Chinese engagements in Turkey and Iran, which is jointly organized actually by the Faculty of Economics and Administrative Sciences, Departments of International Relations and Political Science, and the Strategy and Energy Policies Research Center. Dr. Derya Göçer is an associate professor in the Area Studies program at Middle East Technical University with a PhD in International Relations from the London School of Economics. Her research focuses on Turkey's interactions with the Middle East and Asia, with particular attention to the implications of the Belt and Road Initiative and Turkey's regional dynamics. She has published extensively on issues related to international relations and area studies, including Turkey-China relations and regional security. So it's my pleasure to welcome her actually for this speech, which she will actually use the time to elaborate on Chinese engagements in Turkey and Iran in about 30 minutes. Derya Hocam?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. Yes, if I can go to my first slide. I thought I'd start with an introduction of how me and my very frequent co-author, Dr. Argenç, how we understand China's engagement, global engagement first. And there's a bit of theoretical and empirical elements to it. So we really enjoy reading empirical research that comes out of Global China, which is the name of the research paradigm. That paradigm is composed by scholars who focus not on China as necessarily one-party system with one directional foreign policy, all very centralized, but instead they focus on China's global engagements as multifaceted and actually multi-actored, meaning, yes, there is the party state and there is the leader in China, but there are also several other layers of actors, ranging from companies to local power holders that have an influence and that interact globally as China. So China is then not seen as a monolithic entity, which is generally our criticism to mainstream IR. So we feel like we have to be coherent in that criticism and also apply it to China. So China is not a monolithic entity, but is composed of local actors, commercial actors, and as well as political actors, of course. And then Chinese engagements then across the globe are not seen as one singular central government directive. So go have more ports or go have just more influence, but is way more nuanced and variegated than that. I wanted to give a bit of quotations here for those who like to dig into this global China research paradigm further. A recent article by Hamari and Jones, where they argue that the geoeconomic competition between states, it only materializes, and because China is accused of that, right, using geoeconomic influence as opposed to geopolitical influence over the globe. But that depends on whether and how far state managers can mobilize the required forces, mostly productive force and capital. So just because Chinese central state wishes to have a directive doesn't mean that it will mobilize that capital. Although being an authoritarian state like China, there is more possibilities for it to mobilize that capital. But how US, UK, EU respond to that, how they come up with their geoeconomic competition strategies and how much capital that they can mobilize, which is generally the difference there is wider. And that depends on whether this whole agenda of geoeconomic competition, whether that corresponds to the capital owners and to the productive forces. And for China, when they did their go out strategy and later called Belt and Road Initiative, a lot of the local actors' local agendas corresponded to the larger state agenda of going out. And that made this sudden force of BRI possible. A lot of the BRI is about infrastructure building, and that is also the case with Turkish-Chinese engagements to some extent, whether it's digital infrastructure, whether it's logistics infrastructure. But that drive should not be studied in isolation as a Chinese global infrastructure shaped by multiple actors with different degrees of autonomy. So some of these actors may not be pushing for the infrastructure drive as they stop to do so, I think, or slow down to do so. And after the first 10-year anniversary of BRI, the slogan of BRI has changed, and now it is small and beautiful as opposed to large and infrastructural. So that change comes also from the internal negotiations among Chinese actors. When we focus on Turkey-China relations, if it of course goes back to the 60s and 70s, but for the sake of time, let's focus on the last 10 years or so since the announcement of BRI is 2013, and Turkey joining the BRI, not joining, but it is called the harmonization of Turkey's Middle Corridor project with Belt and Road Initiative in 2015. Since those times, there is an increasing focus on infrastructure and energy cooperation. So it is largely seen as an economic cooperation because political cooperation has many obstacles in front of it. One could be Turkey's NATO membership, another could be the Uyghur issue. Economic cooperation seems safer for all actors involved, not just state actors. Since that start of Turkey's harmonization of its own logistical projects with BRI, there has been many voices from the West concerned about Chinese growing influence in Turkey. And they often overlook a few things. One, Turkey's strategic autonomy that was always in place, even in the Cold War times, and that is still in place. There is some sort of continuity, although there is varying degrees of change as to how autonomous Turkey behaves, but there was always a certain level of autonomy, regardless of Chinese economic cooperation. And they also overplay the Chinese actors' appetite towards investing in Turkey. I remember we hosted the Chinese ambassador last year at Metro in an event, and in the public Q&A session, I asked the ambassador of why they don't invest as much to Turkey compared to neighbors of Turkey, Mediterranean neighbors, as well as Middle Eastern neighbors. And I remember him saying that the economic environment, the market conditions are not conducive for more investment. So, and also he did not say it in these words, but we know from our empirical studies and from others, the political informality that has been on the rise since the transition to presidential system in Turkey, meaning the quick change of laws, the presidential statements that can be changed in a day or overnight, they are not also very, they are not providing a trustworthy investment environment. So sector-wise, we have bilateral trade, yes, but bilateral trade is very much uneven. There is a great trade deficit. There is an energy cooperation. There is the Hunutlu plant, for example, power plant, which is called coal plant, and there are some renewable energy investments. There is a lot of technological exchanges, Huawei being the biggest part of that. We recently submitted an article on that, did field work on digital infrastructure in Turkey and how Huawei dominated it is. It is, I think it's safe to assume it is the death of local industry in terms of digital infrastructure products. And it is 80% or more Huawei dominance. That's the one realm where the West is pushing another anxiety to say that this much digital dominance is also a security issue for NATO, as Turkey is a member of NATO. But then Turkish policymakers respond by saying that other NATO members have also Huawei dominance. So singling out Turkish engagements with China as anxiety producing is discriminatory. Tourism, there is and all sorts of people-to-people interaction. The Turkish counterparts are really willing to increase, for example, tourism, tourists coming from China, but the big Chinese surge hasn't arrived yet to Turkish tourism scene. That is also showing you the limits of Turkish-Chinese engagements, that if it was the case, as the Western, especially think tanks, the knowledge that they produce saying Turkey is now in the Chinese camp, or in another pole in this new multipolar system, then tourism wouldn't be such a sore issue for the Turkish Ministry of Tourism and other policy actors, who in all their bilateral meetings with the Chinese counterparts push for more Chinese tourists. I wanted to give you a case study to make sure that what I'm saying on theoretical and sort of largely empirical stuff is meaningful in the micro empirical scene. Kumport, for example, is one of the biggest Chinese investments across the globe and also in Turkey. It's the one single jewel of BRI investment in Turkey. 65% of its shares are bought by a consortium of 3 Chinese companies led by Costco. It is almost $1 billion American dollars, and it was bought in 2015. And it is not as successful, meaning as successful as it was expected from such a large investment. What is successful, though, for example, is the Greek Piraeus port. That is another big Chinese investment, and that is being expanded, and it has a large volume of, it can accommodate large volume of transit products, which is the logic of Belt and Road Initiative, to make sure that Chinese products flow as frictionless, as fast, and as cheap as possible to Western markets, right? So Kumport is not progressing as much, and we, in an article, we did field work, and we looked into the reasons of that, and we saw that the informalization process of Turkish politics and Turkish bureaucracy after the presidential system changed a lot of the bylaws and laws that relate to ports, to customs, to transit load processing, meaning they changed the costs of owning a port in Turkey, owning a transit port in Turkey, and operating a transit port in Turkey. So Chinese actors, in this case, the Chinese actors are the 3 state-owned enterprises, could not really meet their expected profit margins. And ports are big investments, and anything less than your expected profit margins is a big loss. And it has also not optimized Turkish transit load capacity and Turkish importance in the BRI logistics. As I said, one reason is the changes to legal framework. Another is the policy changes with regards to hinterland of ports, railways. Railways were expected to be privatized more quickly and more efficiently. That hasn't happened. And general informalization of Turkish politics. So BRI engagements with, for example, such as Kumport, they inject a large amount of cash, and they enable the political elite at that time, at that conjuncture, to informalize, because they give legitimacy, or political legitimacy, or we are able to attract this much investment, and they also give financial flexibility. But that informalization, if it's not checked and balanced by other institutions, then it slows down the optimal profit that might come from BRI engagements. And profit is important for Chinese engagements. Going back to what I said about global China, it is not Chinese interest to own a port in Istanbul, in such an important location. No, it is the profit margins of those state-owned enterprises that compete with other shipping companies and port owners across the globe. So their commercial margins matter. I now will look a bit to Iran-China relations, where although Iran attracts a larger Chinese FDI, which comparative slides will come, where Iran and Turkey stand in the larger regional context, still it is less than what Iran would have hoped. Similar in that sense, it is similar to Turkey, I think. It is not as crucial to BRI as it could be in terms of its geographical location. So Chinese relationship with Iran is primarily transactional, based on oil purchases due to sanctions on Iran, which some sanctions that also limit Chinese engagements, especially because Trump introduced secondary sanctions that sort of allowed the United States to sanction third parties that engage with Iran. So China does not care for those sanctions when it comes to oil purchase, but it does slow down anything else China does in Iran. Iran-China relations, when put in the last 20 years of context, Ahmadinejad, when he came to power, he developed this policy called Look East policy, saying there is not much hope to come from engaging with the West. Instead, we should look to our East. That is very similar to when President Erdogan has said the world is bigger than five, or when Modi makes similar statements. So aspiring middle powers trying to balance, right? So he created this Look East policy, but not a lot of some substantial benefit came from it, either geopolitically or geoeconomically. So 2016, the big event for Iran was not a deal with the East, but a deal with the West, which is the nuclear deal JCPOA, which was an opportunity which created an opportunity for China to engage with Iran because it eased the sanctions. And so it became a permissive structure for the rest of the globe to engage with Iran, including China. So immediately, Chinese president visited Iran and tried to come up with new strategical agreements. But then 2 years after, Trump withdrew from the deal very unilaterally. And that slowed down a bit Chinese investments. Although China did not fully stop and continued to engage with Iran, in 2021 created new deals called Strategic Partnership, and Iran applied for Shanghai Cooperation Organization, tried to approach BRICS for membership, none of which have yet materialized, although Iran's Gulf neighbors did join the BRICS this year, or was it late last year? So in Iran-China relations, there is the larger Iranian pivot, in that sense perhaps a bit similar to Turkey, but perhaps more pronounced than Turkey. That is, let's pivot east and let's go to Shanghai Cooperation Organization, let's join BRICS, it will give us an anchor. This is the former president, the late President Raisi, who said Shanghai Cooperation can be transformed into a power that leads the multipolarity. Iran is a connection point in East Asia from north to south, east to west. But for domestic opposition, and this is not just those who are anti-regime, but even for some of those who are pro-regime, the response can be, well, it is amplified in this slogan, Iran is not for sale. But when it's downplayed, Ahmadinejad, for example, criticized these governments, saying you make these deals with China, we don't exactly know what are in there. And then other right-wing commentators in the newspapers or in the Mejlis, in the parliament, saying our Look East policies has not produced anything for our economy besides selling the oil. So, and the balancing, this is not really balancing, because it looks like we have turned our backs to West altogether. And where is the money going, if there is any money coming from these engagements? Lack of transparency in the political regime, of course. Sector to sector, when we look, there is energy and infrastructure focusing on oil and gas investments, and China is the largest importer of Iranian oil. There is some geopolitical cooperation in the Middle East. For example, March 23, China did facilitate a deal to restore Saudi-Iranian relations after the Saudis had executed a Shia clergy, and the Iranian protesters had invaded the Saudi embassy in Iran 7 years before that. Since then, there was a diplomatic rupture between Saudi Arabia and Iran, which are eternally competitive powers, although coming closer. So China did facilitate that deal, but the expectations both in the Middle East and in the West at the time was that this is China starting to become more geopolitically influential. And that expectation failed to materialize, as we know from this year. After the Israel attack on Gaza, the Houthis started to attack Red Sea ships going through Red Sea, and in there China went to Iran to do diplomatic talks so that Iran can exert influence on the Houthis. I will go to the Red Sea issue again in another slide. So that is some geopolitical cooperation. One could classify it as such. So the Western concerns over Chinese influence in Iran fail to account for China's hesitance in investing in this politically fragile, legally very unpredictable environment, I think. So I want to focus on Red Sea logistics crisis because it brings everything together in terms of understanding the opportunities and limits for Chinese engagements in the Middle East at large. So Houthi attacks on the Red Sea shipping lanes, they disrupt global logistics, right? Because through the Red Sea, you go to the Suez Canal, and its maritime routes are more than 90% of global trade, and Chinese products go through maritime routes and they reach Europe. So they even have an impact on inflation in Europe or production processes in Europe when Suez Canal and Red Sea are affected. In response, so this is sort of the map where you can see the Chinese footprint in terms of global ports, and you see how much they care for this, for the transit between the Red Sea and the Suez Canal towards the Mediterranean, right? There is a sort of a concentration in that area. And the only dot in Turkey is the Kumport, and the dot a bit south of that is the Greek Pire port. So China responded to this by not creating, I don't know, creating a platform in which this can discuss, or trying to create a diplomatic, peaceful solution. It used backdoor diplomacy, saying that this is seeing this as an economic issue rather than a geopolitical issue. So although they are right, it takes 2 additional weeks if you go back. If you, instead of Suez Canal, if you have to go back through the through Africa, the continent, it takes 2 more weeks. And so that is very crucial time in global logistics. So they saw it mainly as an economic issue. They have investments in Egypt, Israel, and Greece surrounding that area. COSCO immediately abandoned the route, COSCO being the most prominent Chinese shipping company, a maritime shipping company. Smaller Chinese companies created something called the Red Sea Express, and they used China's criticism of Israel as a factor that would ally them with the Houthis, temporarily ally them with the Houthis, and Houthis gave them immunity. So if these smaller companies could show their Chinese flags and prove their Chinese affiliation, Houthis would then not attack. But that is not a solution to the problem, of course. That is just temporary. And that proves something that especially the NATO powers have been criticizing China over, that they spend a lot of money and influence and time into securing these seas, maritime routes, and China is free riding. It is not contributing to security structure, but it is utilizing that security structure for its economic interactions. But it also proves that China does not have enough leverage over Iran, I think, to stop the Houthi attacks altogether, because COSCO had to abandon the route. So there has to be some risks for them to abandon it. Or China is not interested in using the little leverage it has. We don't know which, but probably a mixture of both. And China probably wanted to wait this out, the Israeli conflict, because there is some normative capital for the state to be gained, right? To be critical of Israel, to be on the side of, as they call the oppressed, to be on the side of the Easterners, which fits their global South narrative, South to South cooperation narrative. But that interest of Chinese state, perhaps foreign policy interest, contradicts with the commercial interest of its own state-owned enterprises, which proves the point that we should not look at China as a monolithic entity when it comes to engaging with Middle East. It had an impact on Chinese trade and manufacturing. The Red Sea crisis, it still does. One of the big impacted parts was auto industries. China exports to Europe either the whole automotive or parts of it, so it even affects the European manufacturing. And last year I thought this could encourage Chinese automakers to build overseas capacity near key markets, so that they don't have to ship it from China, but they can do it within more nearshoring, nearer to Europe. And that has been the case because just a few months ago, BYD, a big Chinese EV electronic vehicle company, announced that they did a deal with Turkey and they're going to build a factory in Manisa. Contrasting Turkey and Iran's engagements with China, Turkey and Iran engage with China differently because they have different domestic political climates. For example, the Uyghur issue is an issue in Turkey, but is perhaps not as much of an issue in Iran. They have different geopolitical priorities. Turkey wants to be a manufacturing and a transit hub. Iran does not have the luxury of such preferences at the moment, and they have, of course, different regional alignments. Yet, I would argue both are still outside the scope of the main BRI. The bulk of BRI investments, as you can see, this is Chinese FDI among Middle Eastern actors. This is my data from the beginning, sort of mid 2024. As you can see, the bulk of it goes to United Arab Emirates. And then Iran is second, but very close, almost equal to Israel. And then Saudi Arabia is almost equal to those, and Turkey is equal to Saudi Arabia. So is Turkey in the middle of all roads, the bridge of everything, and collecting all the investments, and is close to China? No. But is Iran the closest to China? No. If we go to China Med Index, which is a nice index that covers not just the Middle East, but all Mediterranean, you can see again, United Arab Emirates is at the top, and Saudi Arabia and Israel and Iran is the fourth tier, and Turkey is almost after the middle, after Iraq even. And in terms of regional context, let's just focus on the sort of narrower Med circle, Israel, Greek and Turkey, exports to China rising after they joined BRI. So how much did their joining BRI really impacted their economy? So Israel could export way more to China, as you can see, more than 150-fold. Greece could export more to China, although Greece is not a large manufacturing hub. Turkey, who has way more industrial capacity, could not really increase its exports to China, and hence the trade deficit. So joining BRI did not benefit Turkey from that perspective. So I think I'm on time, and this is my last slide, I promise. So my conclusion is the Western concerns over China-Iran or China-Turkey engagements are overhyped. They both reflect, these relationships with China reflect the economic needs of China and the geopolitical positioning and economic needs of the host country. And because both of these, host country and China, are multi-actored entities, they vary across sectors. So in a digital infrastructure, for example, Huawei may be dominant, but let's say when Turkey wants China to be buying more ports, China is shy. So maritime logistics, China is not investing, but digital infrastructure, China is investing, because Huawei has different commercial interests than Chinese ports companies. So even commercial actors do not have the same aligning interests, so that they would have the same harmonious relationship with Turkey. So there is a nice article by Kamba who has listed, and through really large empirical fieldwork, the conditions that Chinese actors consider essential for investment. Not Chinese state, but Chinese actors. And those are three: political stability in the host country, financial stability in the host country, and stability in legislation of that country. And those three, in varying orders, are not very stable either in Turkey or in Iran, way less in Iran, a bit more in Turkey. But for United Arab Emirates, for example, political stability, financial stability, and legislation stability is excellent. There is no democratic conditioning here. There is just a conditioning on stability. Okay, I think that's it from me at this stage.
Thank you, Derya Hocam. It was actually a very beautiful speech, very informative indeed. We will receive questions in a while, but I would like to start with a question, if I may. You emphasize very strongly that Chinese involvement has been largely described as an economic involvement, right? Here, do you emphasize, for example, stability as an important aspect as well? in the sort of inclusion or involvement of China in places where it prefers to be. And of course, here, when we're talking about stability, rule of law and bureaucratic rationality also comes into the picture, as you mentioned in one of your articles. And of course, this refers to the nature and level of institutionalization. I'm curious in this sense, when we're looking at China, considering it only as an economic actor, but not as a political one. I mean, like if we consider, for example, China as an actor that tries to mediate between Saudi Arabia and Iran, for instance, right? Or tries to be involved as a mediator in some of the regional conflicts. We see that China is also interested in regional stability and global stability as well. Would that, for example, necessitate China at one point to be involved politically as well in terms of building institutional capacity?
So if I said that China is not political actor at all, then I have misspoken. That shouldn't be my emphasis. But I'm saying the political imperative behind China's action are overplayed, are overemphasized. So hence my emphasis to the other direction, which is the economy. But China is, of course, trying to build up Chinese state here. Of course, Chinese central state is trying to build up some soft power and some foreign policy repertoire in these regions that are crucial to its economic and political interest. But when it comes to political influence, I think China's focus, although I'm not a China scholar, I'm just a Middle East scholar, but I think China's focus is on the Southeast and its own neighbors. There it is trying to extend its political influence to the governments there, to the elections there. It wants to have more domestic intervention capacity to their domestic affairs as peaceful as it can at the moment, not militarily so, but so Thailand, Malaysia, Taiwan, these are the countries where I think China invests more its political soft power and less so the Middle East. Of course, to have the ambition of being the global power requires to have something to say over Middle Eastern affairs, especially since they have this many investments across the Middle East. But I think what they do is very half-hearted in the sense that they don't put a lot of political will behind these initiatives. For example, think of Saudi Arabia-Iran relationship. So they did facilitate that deal, but that deal was already being cooked, especially by Oman and Iraq, who would benefit from Saudi Arabia and Iran rapprochement way more than China would. And after that, the actors went on their own, and they are very much doing backdoor diplomacy at the moment due to affairs in Israel. So Chinese involvement there seems to be more of a show than of substantiation, I think. But it is important to see that China wants to make this show. So China wants to try of being a mediator and peace broker, but I don't think it has the political repertoire, especially not in this region. But it does have it in its own backyard, which is the other parts of Asia.
Okay, thank you, Hocam. Of course, when we're talking about China's global involvement, we have to speak of the trade wars with the United States. Mm-hmm. And Trump comes into the picture here. He was the president of the United States that started trade wars actually in his previous term. Mm-hmm. And he's actually coming with a promise of challenging the Chinese position as well, especially in terms of trade, and actually as an actor within BRICS as well, in trying to overcome, the role of United States dollar in the international market. Are we sort of destined to face another trade wars, and what repercussions that might have on global stability?
I've been reading as much as I can on this, and then I'm trying to combine this with our global China approach and what we understand, not just necessarily what US does, but how China would respond to it, mm-hmm. because we almost know what US will do, because Trump is saying it every day through Twitter, but we have less info as to what China would respond to. And from what I understand, for understanding any China global strategy, whether it's a trade war or securitization, we have to understand what's happening inside China domestically, because China seems to be more domestic oriented in terms of aligning its foreign policy strategies to its domestic needs. And hence the importance of economy all the time, because most of its domestic needs in this such a large nation of a large population is economic, right? And China under Xi decided to upgrade its industry to gear towards high technology. So China wants to stop being the mid technology manufacturer of the world, where in that division of labor, US is the high technology provider, and China is only providing manufacturing for mid-level products. So China decided to upgrade. Upgrading means producing semiconductors, having more engineers, and through that, US then securitizes that. So US does not want, I think US capital also. In that sense, the capital and the state in United States are aligned, because they do not want high technology manufacturing to go to China. So because US as a capital group, capital groups in the United States are mostly condensed in two realms: finance capital and high technology capital. US is not interested in manufacturing mid-level products anymore anyway, right? So they were happy with that arrangement, but they are not happy with this new arrangement that China is trying to make. So all the focus on Taiwan, high-tech producing, trying to get Taiwan to produce in United States. So we have to understand trade wars are then a leverage for Trump to make sure that China does not do high-tech manufacturing. It's more like sanctions against Iran for nuclear issue, right? So China can do two things. China can respond to it by appeasing a bit, or China can drive the gear further and push more with high technology manufacturing. And I've been reading how Chinese, for example, approach American engineers. They are offering so much for them to come because they will bring knowledge transfer, right? It's not just labor that they bring. But it is also the case that Chinese economy slowed down. There is deflation. So they need the economy to be heated up, and they cannot wait for this high technology upgrading because that's slow. It took US a lot of decades, so it's going to take China a lot of decades. So China has to balance. China has to still manufacture mid-level products and sell it to United States and to Europe. So it cannot be fully bluffing against Trump and saying, do whatever you want, we don't care. So it has to balance its needs to still sell to the rest of the world, mid to high level products, and to upgrade in the meantime its industry. It's a very delicate balance. And Trump will try to force them out of this balance. And in that, Trump aligns with Biden and the rest of US establishment. This is one thing, I think, in US where security, political and economic establishments align, that they don't want China to have this upgrade.
Actually, can we associate in this sense, for example, extraction of raw materials and, for instance, the competition for rare minerals, actually, and materials with this competition and trade wars? I mean, yes, China is basically going to take some time to produce high-tech products, but it has been very skillful in terms of taking the know-how from the West and actually building on that, and creating a technology which is more advanced when compared to its Western examples, for instance, in terms of electrical vehicles.
I don't look into that much about raw materials, because raw materials are more for when you study China in Africa or China in more distant regions, even including Latin America. But I know that securing raw materials is part of the larger issue of securing the supply chain for the high-tech manufacturing. So it's part of this competition, yes, definitely. And the Western EU especially seems to be, EU and United States feel like they've lacked in this issue, and China was more clever in the sense of foreseeing the need to secure these supply chains way before they did. And it's probably also because China is so aware that it is building this new industry from ground up, that they strategize. But for the actors in the United States, they had some capacity already, so they are just trying to keep up with the times as opposed to building it from the ground up. So they did not take that much care of their supply chains. And the pandemic, of course, created a whole new, the COVID pandemic created a whole new securitization of supply chains. So yes, raw materials are, I think, part of that. But at the moment, what I'm reading is more know-how, engineering know-how, and manufacturing capacity. So because not every worker, even if you have the engineers, not every worker can produce semiconductor chips. So even the worker is very high skilled there, right? So there is a lot of competition over these workers as well, especially in Southeast Asia, where you have already Taiwan producing them, and Taiwan then becomes this hotspot. But these are not really my own specialty. That's more for the people who study Asia, proper Asia.
We have a couple of questions from our followers. One from Rafael Hayrulin, for example, asking, how does China leverage its role in the BRICS? I mean, I just checked it. Actually, Iran became a member and Turkey applied for membership, but it was accepted as an associate member recently. How does BRICS come into the picture, for example, in this sense, and how China uses BRICS? I know that you're not looking into that very much, but yes. I'm sure that you have a sort of point there in sort of balancing, creating cooperation on the one hand and actually counterbalancing the Western influence in these regions, in the Middle East, for example.
I, as a larger issue, I don't think China is trying to counteract Western influence. I don't see in any economic or even political action of China for Turkey, especially for Turkey and for Iran. I think China enjoys the fact that Turkey is close to the West, so it becomes a transit hub. China enjoys the fact that there is customs union because it makes sure that once it produces here, it is then, it's subject to different laws and different customs regulations than as if that material would come from China proper, right? So I don't think China wants to decouple Turkey from the West. So BRICS then, I think, has more use for Turkey than for China. Turkey is trying to use BRICS as a way to leverage to the West, saying, I can be closer. I can be closer to the East. It's a balancing act. But I teach modern Iranian history from late 19th century up until today. And I also teach Constitutional Revolution, Ottoman Empire, and down to Turkish Republic, etc. So looking at the very long durée, balancing different actors to one another is, a very strong tradition in both Turkey and in Iran, right? It was before Russia and England, then France. So it was always there for Iran. It is part of their foreign policy making strategy. So they call it a third power strategy. So there's one, there's the other. So they found a third party to balance both. So in that sense, it is not Chinese interest and influence so much, but it is the local actors, Turkey and Iran, how they use these platforms for their balancing purposes. I think we should focus more on what they say and what they do. For example, our president in Turkey uses BRICS and any other Eastern platforms for political legitimacy. And it has a lot of domestic repercussions more than sometimes foreign policy repercussions, to say that don't worry, we have a place in this world. Even if we're not excellent shape in our Western relations, we have others to relate with. And we are a strong country to perform that national role towards its own domestic constituency. The same for Iran, where Iranian regime's legitimacy needs are even higher than Turkish presidents. Right? Because in Iran, they have a very hostile domestic scene, and there's at any time protests can break out. So the regime is very volatile there. So BRICS, or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, is for them to say, we are not an isolated island. We are linked and anchored to this world. We do have a place in this world. So studying a lot domestic politics in Iran and in Turkey, that would be my 5 cents.
Thank you, Ajam. The interaction of the domestic and the international is essential in understanding. And of course, the balancing issue is one of the very important aspects of Turkey's relations with major actors it's good to see that there are similarities with Iran too there. We have a couple of more questions. One, I can ask them maybe consequently.
Yes.
How would the economic relationship between Turkey and China be impacted if trade wars did not exist? A little bit speculative in that sense. But if I may add the next one from Ibrahim Hoca here, how China's One Belt, One Road initiative might affect China-Turkey, but along this actually Turkey-US relations. If we consider, trade wars to be a matter of reality in the picture, of course, you said China is not interested in creating a disconnection between between Turkey and the West. But what happens if trade wars are, more intensified, and US, in this sense, is more interested in ousting actually China from certain areas?
Okay, I'll start with the first, and probably will merge with the second. I think this is a good question because it allows me to say this. It is not just the Western interest to sort of wage trade wars on China. Turkish Trade Ministry has been applying a very high level of tariffs against certain Chinese products. And it has been increasing these tariffs and using tariffs as a leverage to get other things that they want from China. So this is not just a US policy or a UK policy. This is also something that Turkey does. And in our field interviews, we saw that the ministry believes that it is leading the way for EU to decouple from China if necessary, saying we paved the way for them. We increased the tariffs on electronic vehicles, for example. They were the ones to raise it first 10%, and now then they raise it to almost 40%. And then what did they get in return? They got the BYD manufacturing factory in Manisa after they raised the tariff so much. So I think trade wars are a reality of not just US and China, but it's one of the tools that states and all sorts of and commercial actors pressuring their own states to use against each other. So Turkey is sometimes very open in China to China, saying opening its markets, for example, but on solar panels, that was another subfield, because Turkish local industries were wanting to improve their panel production. So because they saw a lot of profits to be made in the renewable energy transition. But Chinese cheap solar panels were flooding the market in Turkey. So the trade ministry increased the tariffs on Chinese solar panels. And that did sort of push out some sort of Chinese products outside of Turkish market, but it brought new ones then later. So because as my informants in Turkish state and business sector, they tell me, Hocam, if you get rid of Chinese from one door, they come through another door. that is what both business actors and political actors. He says they say they are relentless, especially the commercial actors of China. So yes, there are trade wars, but there are many trade backdoors, and Chinese many different state-owned enterprises are very skilled in finding those backdoors, and they are relentless. In terms of Turkey-US relations, I think it might at times be a tension point, especially, for example, Trump, if it pushes more on Huawei, sanctions against Huawei, tariffs against Huawei, banning of Huawei, which they already done, then they pushed United Kingdom to do that. The United Kingdom said we will do it gradually, but the rest of Europe and Turkey are still using Huawei products. So if Trump one day decides to extend the Huawei ban to all of his allies and say either you're with me or you're against me on that point, then that would create a tension point for Turkey-US relations, because Huawei is such an integral part of this country's internet and all sorts of telecommunications. So in some, I think, especially in digital infrastructure, I see potential factors there that might impact Turkey-US relations, but I don't think that would come from China, but it would come from United States.
Yeah, Trump factor actually is coming into the picture once again. I would actually extend this question, if I may, to Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates as well. You might not have looked into them in very much of a detail, but I'm sure you're following it because you're following the Middle East closely. I mean, these countries have been basically trying to transform their economies and looking into new sectors and investing heavily actually in sort of diversifying their economy, especially, you know, with the run for green economy. In this sense, they're trying to diversify away from fuel, actually, and petrol, oil sectors. In this sense, China has been an important factor in this respect, and actually, the numbers you have shown regarding Chinese investments indicates very strongly how China is involved in these countries, both United Arab Emirates more extensively there. I think largely because it's a trade hub as well, in this sense, and in Saudi Arabia too. I mean, these two countries are also very close allies of the United States too. When you look at from this point, how do you expect, for example, the United States or Trump administration to act in the context of trade wars, in trying to limit Chinese involvement in its allies, or how would you expect the Chinese and, you know, the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis to respond to this?
You're right. China does invest in these countries in two realms. First, in renewable energy investments because of their diversification attempts. So what does it do? So it invests, it provides the capital, further capital, or it becomes a capital share in solar power plants, for example, large solar farms. And it also invests in their logistics to some extent. And United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia are also competing with one another in terms of who will diversify further, better, and who will have more global influence. And in that realm, they seem to have chosen different fields. United Arab Emirates seems to focus more on logistics and maritime logistics, especially because of being a trade hub. United Arab Emirates, I think, is trying to emulate Singapore as a model. So United Arab Emirates is trying to buy ports in Turkey, for example, or across the Mediterranean through its sovereign Abu Dhabi ports, its sovereign funds. So for that, it doesn't need China. I think United Arab Emirates, although attracting this much Chinese investment, it doesn't need it necessarily for its diversification strategy. Saudi Arabia seems to focus more on energy, renewable energy, as well as, you would know more, land grabbing in Africa, agricultural issues, etc. For that requires a different kind of investment, and in there, and because of the proximity to Africa, probably Saudi Arabia needs to align with China a bit more than United Arab Emirates. But I think Trump's strategy in his first term was to be on very good terms with Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. That seems to be Trump's approach to Middle East. Not through Turkey, not through Israel necessarily, I think, not through Egypt, but through the Gulf countries. So, and that created, as my mentor, probably your mentor, Professor Altunışık says in one of her pieces, a Gulf-centered Middle East. So she sees the rise of a Gulf-centered Middle Eastern regional system. And Israel's war has derailed this a bit, but when Trump comes and stops the war, I don't know through what kind of interactions, but probably he will stop it to some extent. Then that continuity will pick up again on the rise of the Gulf as the Middle East, the main Middle East center. And I don't think Chinese investment to these two countries will stop Trump from doing that. That is his main strategy, looking at the Middle East. He enjoys interacting with these actors. Even his son has invested a lot in Saudi Arabia. So there is a lot of profits to be made in Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates. So I think it's, and as they say, the cake is big enough for China and United States. And it is not trade war, because it is not a matter of trade and tariffs. It is a matter of investments. So that is a bit more difficult to sanction as opposed to trade. So yes, that would be again my 5 cents.
I have 2 more questions before we finish, short ones. The first one from Zehra Hocam will take you out of Middle East for some time. I mean, recently we see developments concerning actually China's relations with African countries, especially the debt crisis that's emerging because of the inability of African countries to repay China in this sense. And here we see Chinese banks' willingness to focus on fiscal stabilization as a process. I believe this is a process that is still distant from the Middle East, as Middle East countries are more wealthy in this sense. But that might shape the very first question that I asked, actually, the intention to be involved in institutionalization by China. What is your opinion on that?
Well, I don't know much about Africa, although I do know two things. One, that Chinese learned a lot. Chinese banks and state-owned enterprises learned a lot from their African experience. And hence the change in BRI structure to small and beautiful, as opposed to large African railways or large factories in Africa. That the African experience, I think, transformed the Chinese actors. That is the only thing I know. So they would focus on fiscal stabilization, continue to focus on fiscal stabilization, but probably for the sake of political peacekeeping, they wouldn't also bankrupt these African countries, because that is the Western discourse about China, right? China is creating debt trap diplomacy. Although I remember reading these statistics, the more investment an African country is getting from China, the more it is likely to align in its UN voting, UN General Assembly voting with China. This is called friendshoring and friend voting. So in that sense, yes, a focus on fiscal stabilization is important for the commercial actors of China, but it is perhaps less important for the Chinese political state, because Chinese political state has also a UN agenda or a WTO agenda, right? So that is again where the commercial and political interests sometimes contradict one another. So that might be such a realm.
Can that be a precedent for Chinese interest to establish a certain model of an economic approach in Africa, for example? Do they have such an intention?
I don't think they have that interest and intention. They do say this discursively. They do have it. They have something called Global Development Initiative, where they say we are creating a new model for global South development. The post-Second World War development schemes have failed. Now we are offering ours, but there is nothing inside it. That is substantially. It's not like a Marshall Plan for the 21st century. That it is not.
Okay, one final question, if I may, linking it to BED and your actually statements on Iran. You said in Iran there was actually criticisms that Iran is not for sale, first thing. Yeah. And it actually did not produce anything for the economy, the relationship with China. Yeah. I mean, when we look at African states, actually, we see similar complaints, the difficulties in creation of employment, contributions to the economy, gains from Chinese involvement in that sense. And when we're reading the developments concerning the BYD investments in Turkey, we see that actually it's going to be largely based on Chinese workers and their involvement in Manisa. And actually, there is a talk of creating new areas for the Chinese in Manisa.
Chinatown. Yes, I read that too. I had the pleasure of being able to do field work on this in our new round of field works on electronic vehicles and BYD. And what I learned is that even the Turkish policymakers fear that it will be more of an assembly line rather than real manufacturing. And that's the thing with Chinese investments in Turkey, that are two different. Our Industry and Technology Ministry produces this document called Local and National Document. It's a certification to certify that this document is local and national, so that then they would be subject to certain incentives, economic incentives. Right? And Chinese actors sent a lot of stuff here just to be assembled here, not really produced here, so not really creating employment, not really creating know-how transfer, technology transfer, not really creating added value for this country, just an assembly line, but they make sure that it fits the ministry's local and national criteria. So then on the paper, it looks as if it's a Turkish product without really bringing any spillover benefits to that country. And from Africa, I remember a case where, because I read a lot of logistics, what is the decision? How are the decisions made, for example, to lay railroads, which routes to take? And I've been reading that Chinese state-owned enterprises make the choices so that the railroads lead to rare mineral mines, rather than becoming a route in which the local industries, would be facilitated, would be interacted with one another, so more economic interaction would happen in that country. So yes, there is that, but I can assure you that the Turkish policymakers know of this, and they are trying to deal with it, and they also confess how difficult it is to deal with this, because that's the one thing where political and economic merge in Chinese engagements with the globe. And that is, Chinese state-owned enterprises have so much state financial support that they enter a market or they enter a country with a lot of finances. So at times they even sell for free for the first year or so, for example, so that they can have that market domination. And that is not something that any other country can emulate, can imitate, right? So there they have a huge advantage. So Turkish actors, African actors, even Balkan actors, Southeast Europeans, they have a lot of difficulty in dealing with the aggressiveness of Chinese commercial actors.
Considering that economic nationalism is very heavily actually exercised in today's politics, do you see that as a negative aspect for Chinese involvement in various countries? Given all this,
or the political legitimacy of the host country, yes. But there, as you see in Turkey, the slogan is local and national, but then it's 65% Chinese. But does it really translate to domestic politics? I doubt. I know it. Many of my other, it's an academic knowledge. We have it. As a journalistic knowledge, a lot of independent journalists follow these kinds of political economic issues. But does it translate to domestic political scene where, the curtain is unveiled from the local and national symbol? I doubt it. I think it's also a defense industry issue as well. How much of Turkish defense is really Turkish defense, right? How much of it is an assembly? But I think the current media structure and the political discourse is so closed. It is not an open structure. It's a closed structure. So these discussions we do among ourselves, and it doesn't translate to the public.
Okay, thanks a lot, Hocam. It was great hosting you here, actually. Very informative, very detailed, actually, moving from one area to the other. If you have any last word.
Thank you for the invitation and for the wonderful questions.
Okay, thank you, actually, for following us. Hopefully, in the upcoming period, we will have experts further elaborating on the role of China. Thanks very much.